So, hey, Mirela, really happy to have you today on this ProdCamp interview where we are looking to talk about product-led growth and have the most pragmatic approach to this motion, understand where it can fit, when it's relevant, and how it can be maybe combined to other motions to find the right balance for company. And I'm really happy to have you today, Mirela. Maybe you can start by telling us a few words about you for those who don't know you and why you are relevant to talk about this topic.
I'm Mirela, founder of Product People. We're the premier destination for product management services in Europe, working with a few unicorns and digital-first companies, ranging from Zalando to Omio and many others. And some of these clients are under NDA, including one of Europeans' banking unicorns. We've noticed that about 50% of our clients work with product-led tactics. Maybe to step a bit back, what is this? It means that they're utilizing this distribution model where the product does the selling for them and acquires new customers or expands their offering via self-service, word of mouth, referrals, and so on and so forth, including gamification tactics and others. It's also been quite productive in B2B due to the consumerization of software and the decision-making moving from C-level in many cases to just the ICs, individual contributors who are using these products. And probably a very famous example is Slack and then Figma, where a lot of their growth was through these tactics. And then that helped them crawl their way into enterprise. I hope this gives you an idea on where my position is on this and our experience.
It does. Thank you so much for the additional context. And we understand that you are a very relevant person to have this conversation with. So it's great to have you today. And so the topic of today was really to try to debunk a bit PLG and try to understand how it can fold in an organization and when it can be relevant, and maybe also when it's not necessarily relevant, because there is a big trend about like everyone should adopt PLG, not necessarily from the people who are the specialists of PLG, but from the company's owners or the board members. This is a strong push toward PLG, and I think that everyone wants to understand when it's relevant and maybe when it's not. So can you help us understand it a bit better?
And a great way to define what something is good for is to also say what is not good for or when it's not a good time. Pre-product market fit, you shouldn't look at that. You should do a lot of things that don't scale to really understand your use cases, your users, the pain that you're solving, exactly what their job to be done is, and a wedge for your product to go in. There are also some types of products or use cases that don't have an organic engagement loop, or it won't be the core of it even if you add it. Thinking of HR compliance tooling, cybersecurity assessment and training inside companies, right? No one wants to do that HR compliance module. You're just going to have to stick to it because that's part of the game, and a company wants to minimize its risk by having their employees do these trainings. So you're going to sell to HR departments and compliance folks. It's very unlikely that one of the people working inside of this company says, oh, I really want to sit through this module. It could still be the case that some small PLG tactics could work there. Like, for example, the HR people in charge of this could discover the tool and tell their boss to buy it and so on and so forth. So there's still like some PLG motions that can work. But it's unlikely that this is going to spread like wildfire the way Miro and Figma and Slack did, where everyone in the organization finds some use for it, even if there are some functions that will drive it more than others. And if you think of Miro or Miro, people pronounce it differently, it's such a great collaboration tool, and also brainstorming and doing retros and everything. So a lot of teams adopted it for their use cases, as well as even doing visual presentation. They're moving away from Google Slides or PowerPoint. And one thing people should be aware of, because I know that in general, companies tend to see a trend and then management would go to their people and say, be more agile, be more PLG, and so on. And they will be like, what is that? Let me ask ChatGPT and see what it goes. There are a lot of cases where it doesn't work, and we should still be acutely aware of the market and how sales processes work. It's a lot easier in B2C, right? The buyer is the user. You can make a lot of impulse decisions, but at the same time, you can also churn very fast if something shiny or catches your attention. And that's why you see people are not personally using Confluence, right? That still remains a B2B enterprise or startup tool, but they personally use Notion and sometimes bring Notion into their organization. But still, Notion is not as strong as enterprise sales. And my point with this is you're still going to need sales. The moment you have a longer decision chain, the moment you need to handhold someone through a procurement process or vendor onboarding or IT security assessment or anything and everything, and the larger an organization is, the more red tape it's going to have, and the more you just need someone to help not fall through the crack.
So just to pause on that and on the comparison of Confluence and Notion, I think it's really interesting. So what you're saying is basically Notion managed to implement a better PLG motion, having this clear value and use cases for everyone in the org, just like Miro pretty much did, while Confluence had this more sales motion toward B2B companies and not necessarily adopted or succeeded to adopt the PLG approach, in the sense that not everyone could see the value right out the gate, but you needed to have the decision maker on board to be able to deploy that in an org. Am I getting that right, or am I missing something here?
So for Notion works in individual use cases, right? You can plan your vacation to Japan to see the cherry tree. Notion works in individual use cases pretty well. You can plan your vacation to Japan and seeing the cherry trees in bloom there in spring and all of that. Whereas you wouldn't do that in Confluence. It doesn't mean that Jira and Confluence and the whole Atlassian suite has its own PLG tactics. For example, being free for under a certain number of users. And that's quite clever because it attracts startups who are a bit scrappy, don't have that much money to put into a tool. And if these startups manage to grow big enough, then they start getting charged for the seats that they're using. So they do have this part. It's just that it's less likely that one person is going to create a Jira backlog for themselves and put that in Confluence and so on, right? So it's still targeted at organizations. I don't have the hate for Jira and friends as others do, because I have seen worse. I have seen the DevOps tooling from Microsoft and all these other alternatives. So it's fine. On the other side, if you compare it, Notion stops being effective after a 500 people count in an organization. And I saw organizations who really wanted to do their ticket tracking and bug management via Notion tasks. It didn't scale very well. It didn't work very well. It ended up being a bit confusing. It was also 2 years ago where the Notion search was absolutely terrible. So you needed to just bookmark anything you wanted to find because you wouldn't have found it again, ever. It was like so bad. So it may change in the future, right? This podcast may not age very well, but it also shows that there are things that are good to one approach and great to another type of approach, and there's no way of doing it. It comes back to understanding who you're selling to, what problem you're solving for them, how do you get the stickiness in there, and then how do you get people to bring in others to use. There are some numbers backing the PLG approach being more efficient. There's this study that Bain did on about 200 companies in 2023 and looked at the ones being product-led versus not product-led. What percentage of them are exceeding the rule of 40, means growing at a 40% rate with over 40% margin? Who doesn't want a nice large margin, right? And at the same time growing without burning money. And there's about a 5 to 6% difference in the ones that are product led manage to do it better than the ones that are sales led. And that's a pretty good efficiency gain if you think about the customer acquisition payback time, which also is shown to be shorter in PLG, and just the sheer cost of having all the sales orchestration around it, just how much time, although that is needed. A good example I've also seen with 1Password, where at some point my company, Product People, started growing quite fast. So probably 1Password saw that accounts were added to their tool at a pretty fast rate. And then, of course, we got the email from sales wanting to have a chat with us, understand how we were using these, trying to upsell the next pricing tier, and so on and so forth. And I felt that was very clever because we had a self-service, we did what we wanted, and at some point we became relevant as a company because it was the times where we doubled within a year our headcount. And that's where it makes sense for a human to speak with someone at that company and try to understand them better and potentially move them into a more lucrative deal for that software vendor.
What I found interesting, what you're saying, and if I understand that correctly, is that pretty much it was PLG in 1Password till the moment you reached a certain sales motion signal, and then sales came in. And so that's how typically you could combine a PLG motion with a sales motion, right?
It's also the most effective way, because as in everything, companies are humans all the way down. And as a PM within a B2B organization, also leverage sales, and everyone has some point to it. But you can also find a way to work together more productively, right? The low value prospects have self-serve funnel. And at some point, you can send some signals within your product where you detect a company worth talking to. And those insights will then be very valuable also for the product team to understand how they can move up market.
I love that. And just to take a step back to something you were saying earlier about statistics around PLG, I found always it very interesting because for me, it's always hard to decipher whether PLG is better just per se and just better, or the company that selected PLG, it made sense for them to select PLG, and that's why it works better. It's always hard to understand that if PLG per se is better, or it's just because those companies choose this motion because it made sense for them and for the type of product, for the type of problem they solve. And so, yes, it worked better because that was the right contextual choice, not necessarily the right motion choice.
You're right. I agree with you, Matei. When serving clients that are in industries where agile is a novelty, so we saw that in maritime logistics or just logistics in general or telecom, those companies are currently still struggling with agile, right? So it's about like a 10-year gap between what everyone else did because everyone else moved away. We can do a Kanban and a 2-3 week sprint, but then we don't bother with it that much. And it's just like everyone is used to it and not super discussed. So whenever we talk with clients that are a bit behind the curve on that, then you see that they're fascinated about agile, and that's usually a sign that they haven't gone over it. And the reason they're also looking at all of this transformation part, and the first thing they pick off the shelf is agile, which I think that at this point, if you're a company that hasn't done that much before, it's better just to skip a step and look what's beyond it, especially with generative AI, who is going to shortcut a lot of the workflows and processes that you had in place with basic automation or putting yet another department to do something that may not be needed at all. It's a bit of a selection bias. It's also what that specific industry could sustain, because if everyone in logistics is used to wine and dine salespeople, and you're not going to be able to compete if you go to your approach, yeah, please sign up via this website, chop, right? So at most, you're going to be able to do some of these motions internally, but still the interface needs to be, like being compatible with an old API. You need to support these very old school versions of interfacing, and you can do some things internally that make sense, because all of this stuff is a spectrum, and ultimately you're responsible for making the product successful within your context, and especially in this day and age, commercially successful, especially for long-term account value or customer lifetime value or whatever you call it. Don't go too much with like whatever random people say on the internet, but look at what's happening there in your industry, in your product. And there's also the part where culture just affects so much of it, right? Because if your company is used to selling to a certain type of buyer in a certain old school way, then the people who are going to get a lot of visibility in your organizations are the one doing that, which then also affects a little bit the culture there, because this is how the world works, right? Management team is going to reward people bringing in revenue because management team needs to justify what they're doing to their shareholders and pay salaries and everything. So then that has this cascading effect internally. It's way more productive for a PM or a product leader to understand that this comes in pairs, right? So what makes them successful is also sometimes their worst attribute. Your faults are sometimes driven by what you're good at. So for example, I like taking fast decisions and not spending a lot of time on something until I see that the value is there to spend time on it, which makes me sometimes less effective in organizations that need a lot of relationship building, because I'll be like, okay, who's in my work stream? A, B, C, D, E. Here's like how we work together. Here's the meeting and so on. And I sometimes forget that you need the meeting behind the meeting and the coffee chat behind the coffee chat, and like waste a bunch of time to get to know some people, and that the org chart doesn't fully represent what the power structure is like, because there are like some people who have been sidelined, lost the trust of management, have already resigned but is not public yet, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, in organizations that are pretty straightforward to navigate and went towards more of this streamlined approach, I'm super effective. It's like a chicken and egg type of problem, right? It's pretty hard to get everything right at the same time. And I think companies as well end up doing this min-max thing where they're very good at some things and some things work very well there because that works with their culture, business environment that they're in, and maybe just the personality of some very influential people there, but they may be very poor at some other stuff and completely missing it. And it's not just small companies. If you think of the whole Google and Amazon comparison, there's someone who has a write-up from a long time ago that was an engineer at both, and explains that a lot behind Amazon's growth was the platform strategy that they adopted early on. And they adopted that not because they were product driven, because he goes on a rant of how Jeff Bezos would micromanage the pixels on the Amazon work page to the point that like someone tried to change his mind for a few years, bringing all the data and all the studies and everything, and then just left and the homepage stayed the same. But they, at the same time, they were ruthlessly efficient because they made every internal team communicate with other teams just through APIs. And there's a famous letter that he sent that ends up with, from the next days onwards, you should do that. Everyone who doesn't will get fired. And there's a joke that and sometimes they reproduce this with "have a nice day" at the end, and then other people say, no, joking. That wasn't in the letter. So on one hand, they did a lot of things wrong, but they had a structural thing done right that then made them more efficient than Google, who struggles to launch products, as we also see now with them struggling to catch up with OpenAI's ChatGPT and having these laughable releases. That's also part of it, right? So Amazon, the core product that we all know, is quite unusable even after all these years. You got used to it because they also provided of value that made people like not care about how it looks, right? Fast delivery, relatively cheap prices, large inventory that were from their day one part of the core value proposition. But at the same time, they weren't as innovative with products like Google, right? There's no Amazon Maps, you're using Google Maps. They don't have Google Suite and so on. So it's a mix of both. You just need to make it work in your context, and that there's no thing you can just copy off the shelf, because otherwise everyone would do it, right?
If only there was this secret map to product excellence, that would be so much easier, or this perfect blueprint to just have to copy paste on our company and just make it a multi-billion-dollar company. It would be too simple and everyone will be billionaire. So it's not like that. And thank you for these thoughts. And one last question
100%.
I want to ask you to before we wrap it up is, did you ever see PLG works per se in a company that targeting enterprise accounts? Is any of the example you had in mind matching this?
Of course, there are a lot of cases. Like if you think of Miro, Miro managed to expand in very large organizations. If you think of the Adevinta group that owns a lot of the class fields, classifieds in Europe, and so on and so forth. But then that also took a lot of product work behind the scene that you don't see. Having the data stored within the EU and convincing all the departments there that it's safe to put their input within the Miro boards because they will still be compliant, and so on and so forth. And I think this is also part of the work that is not praised at all, because you have all the trendy, product should not do program management or project management or product ops. But to win these enterprise accounts, you would need to just do the grunt work, the unsexiest DSA Act compliance, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for your time, Mirela. Thank you for your input. Have a great day.